All right, we are here with J.B. Pritzker, the Democratic candidate for governor. We appreciate you being here today and invite you to start by providing an opening statement as to why you think you're the best candidate for this office.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you here at the Journal-Register and to the audience that's viewing this. Look, I'm running for governor because everything that we care about is under attack right now by a president and Congress in Washington, D.C., and their partner in Springfield, Governor Bruce Rauner. Governor Rauner, as you know, failed to pass a budget for 2 years, and a third year he vetoed the budget, and that devastated human services across our state. It made it much more difficult for businesses that wanted to move to the state of Illinois, businesses that wanted to get started or grow in the state of Illinois. The complete instability of the state and state government that he caused has really hurt our prospects in Illinois for job creation, for expanding health care so that we cover everybody, and making sure that we get a quality education for every child. These are priorities of mine. I've been fighting for many years now to expand education, particularly for our very youngest children, our most at-risk kids in early childhood education. I've been a national leader in expanding preschool and child care, something I think we can do in the state. I fought to expand the No Kid Hungry program across the state of Illinois to 230,000 children in low-income school districts so they could get breakfast every day. I led the building of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, which teaches more than 60,000 kids every year to fight bigotry and hatred and intolerance. And I ran the Illinois Human Rights Commission, a bipartisan commission for the state of Illinois. We need real change in the state. We've got to address the problems of our pension system, making sure that we step up to the plate and pay the pensions that are owed. We've got to create jobs. And we need a health care system that covers everybody. And I put forward a real plan that does not cost the taxpayers anything, that will allow us to expand coverage in the state. It's time to put Springfield back on the side of working families, and that's the kind of governor that I'll be.
Okay. You've invested a huge amount of money into this race, of your personal money, more than $100 million of your own dollars. Why would anyone with the type of personal wealth you possess want to be governor of a state that has the multitude and magnitude of problems that we have here in Illinois?
I live here. I love this state. I've raised my family here. My family came to Illinois as refugees many years ago, and it was the people of Illinois that welcomed them, that gave my great-grandfather a place to live when he had nothing. He was penniless and did not have a place to live. It was a human service agency, actually, that did that for him. A public school taught him English and gave him a good education. A public university gave him a higher education. My family owes a lot to this state and to this nation, and I believe that it's our obligation to stand up and do the right thing, to fight for the working families of Illinois. That is, again, one of the big reasons why I decided to run for governor. Yes, I suppose I could have done a lot of things. I certainly have a career before I ran for governor. But it's important to me that we lift up everybody in the state, especially the forgotten communities across Illinois, not just in central and southern Illinois, but also the people who've been forgotten and left out. This governor, I think, has failed working families, has made it harder. We already had challenges in the state before he became governor. He promised to try and fix them, and frankly, he's been an utter and complete failure at doing that. And so I believe that my history of getting big things done is example of what I can do as governor, what I will do as governor.
I could argue it's damaging to democracy that to have the amount of money you're spending, the amount of money Bruce Rauner is spending into these campaigns. Can a person who's not a millionaire or billionaire be governor of Illinois? Is this going to hurt the fabric of our state?
Well, I think you may know that I've supported a lot of candidates over many years who've run for public office. I do think that people of all income levels, people of all races, should have opportunities to run for public office, and do, and I've supported them in doing that. I do not think that we should have so much money in politics today. I think that it isn't good for the political arena, for government, that we have too many situations in which people like Bruce Rauner are running for office, where, remember, he's the one who wrote a $50 million check in December of 2016 into his own campaign account and then raised $20 million from one individual in the state of Illinois. So he had $70 million in an account. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to scare people away. And he probably did successfully scare some people away. But we need to get rid of all that money in politics, but you've got to overcome it. I don't know if you remember Paul Simon, a senator who was fighting for campaign finance reform, said that we need to stand up and get rid of all the money in politics, but we can't unilaterally disarm while we're doing it. We've got to elect people who actually believe in it. I do believe in campaign finance reform, and I think there are real changes that we could bring here in the state. We need to also, of course, fight for it at the federal level. To make sure that our federal officials are looking at making big changes. Citizens United is a terrible development for our country. The Supreme Court, of course, has made it easier for individuals to write large checks. And now you see the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and all of the wealthy people on the right are stepping up and writing big checks for their candidates, including Bruce Rauner. And here on the Democratic side, on the left, and supporting candidates on our side, we have many fewer people. I've tried to stand up and help people run for public office, but again, we need to make real changes in the system.
So if you were elected governor, you would advocate on the state and national level for that type of reform, so that you would not be able to spend the same type of money you're spending this time in a subsequent election?
Yes, I believe that we need to make real changes in the law here in the state. Look, you can't control, as governor, you can't control the federal government, but you can use the bully pulpit of the governorship to encourage our federal officials and, in Washington, not just the ones from Illinois, but around the country, to make real changes, and I want to do that.
Okay. Your personal wealth, your business endeavors raise questions about if you have any conflicts of interest. Have you disclosed all your financial interests so that the public can make an informed decision about whether they believe you have conflicts of interest?
Yes. In fact, as you know, there's a statement of economic interest that each candidate puts forward. I listed every asset that I own, every asset that's owned by trust for my benefit, and made sure that people know exactly what those ownership interests have been. Of course, as you also know, for the last 20 months, I have completely separated myself from businesses that I was previously involved with, and today I am working hard to make sure that we're fighting for expanding the economy of the state. But I'm doing that as a candidate for governor, and will do it as governor. But I was doing that before I decided to run for governor, and you can see that on my statement of economic interest.
You released that statement of economic interest, but not your full tax returns. Will you release your full tax returns?
Well, I put forward, as you know, my tax returns for 3 years, the front pages of it, yep, and as well, again, told everybody what the taxes were that I paid for the last 3 years at the federal level, at the state level, and again, the statement of economic interest lists every asset.
But will you release your full tax returns?
I think the information that we put forward is fairly self-explanatory. And remember that the conflicts that people are looking for in all the candidates are really reflected in a statement of economic interest. That's the whole purpose of that document.
Okay. You've criticized Governor Rauner for his business investments. How can you criticize him when you're not willing to release similar information about your business interests?
Oh, no, I have, in fact, revealed in our statement of economic interest each of our investments.
Okay. You said this week during a radio interview that you think half of funding for public schools should come from the state. Right now, about a quarter of the funding is from the state, so it's going to take billions of dollars to bring it up to half. Where does that money come from?
Well, we need to work our way toward that. Remember that the challenge here that we have in the state is that we really have fallen from the ranks of states that fund education to the ranks of the bottom of states that fund education. So today we're 49th out of 50 states in state funding for education. I don't think that's something that we should be proud of. I believe that the reason that our property tax system is so out of whack and so high for so many people is that that we fund schools improperly, that if we could change that funding mechanism to have the state step up to the plate, and we can lower local property taxes if we do that, and we also fund schools more properly. That's certainly something that I've made a central focus of my campaign, making sure that we're funding K-12 education more properly and putting in place a fair tax system. So that's the primary area that I think we can make changes in the tax system. Look, I have also put forward ideas about legalizing marijuana, for example. I think that we can bring in nearly $1 billion of revenue to the state, and legalizing sports betting is something that we should look seriously at. Those are revenue methods. There are also cuts in state government and efficiencies that we should bring. Some of those, which unfortunately Bruce Rauner doesn't believe in, are around prevention. Under Rauner, many of the preventative measures around Medicaid spending, around our K-12 education system have been woefully underfunded or defunded by Bruce Rauner. I think we ought to bring those back because they save money for the state. Making those smaller investments actually saves money for the state in a much larger way. Early childhood education is an example, of course, investment in HIV testing, in detection of diabetes, treatment early of diabetes. All of those things are ways that we can significantly cut spending in state government.
Okay. Let's get into the idea for changing our tax structure. Moving to a graduated income tax is something you have been talking about quite a bit on the campaign trail. Share with us what you have in mind about changing the structure. What's your idea?
I think everybody should understand that the vast majority of states in the United States have a progressive, fair income tax system, including the federal government. We're actually one of the laggards among the 50 states in adopting a fair tax system. I think it's important for us to recognize that those who are paying taxes, who are at the bottom 20% of taxpayers, those who have the lowest incomes, who are taxpayers, are paying actually the highest rates of tax overall, including the sales taxes, including property taxes. When you put all of the burden that people are paying, it's actually much higher for people at the bottom end than it is for people at the top. I think we just need to make it more fair, and the best way to do that is to lower the burden on property taxes, lower taxes for the middle class and those striving to get there, and ask people who are wealthiest in the state to step up to the plate. So that's what I intend to pursue. I think it's important for us to include the voices of Republicans and Democrats in that negotiation. And of course, to get it done, we would need to have a vote of the legislature and a vote of the people of the state of Illinois. And so that's what we would have to get done.
Okay. So what are the types of brackets you envision, the rates that would be paid by each one of those?
Well, again, I think that involves both sides of the legislature, both houses of the legislature, and both parties in order to determine what those rates ought to be. And there would be a lot of input, of course, by representatives of the people who will get to vote on it, as well as the voters themselves who will get to vote on it ultimately in a referendum on a constitutional amendment.
I mean, so I've heard you say a lot, the wealthy will pay more taxes under this type of system. So what is wealthy?
Well, certainly Bruce Rauner and I ought to pay more. I wonder whether Bruce Rauner's opposition to a progressive income tax is because he's unwilling. I do not think that wealthy people in the state should pay the same rate as a child care worker, as a construction worker, a nurse. So the principles of a fair tax system are fairly well established, and that's what I would go after. Again, the definition of where the rates would be is something that would be determined by the legislature in part in negotiations and would have to be presented to the people for their support.
I just think, wealthy is so subjective. I mean, Todd's my boss. I might think what he makes is wealthy. He probably thinks what his boss is wealthy. I mean, can you define what you see as middle class then, I guess? What is so that people know, okay, if I vote for JB, this is what it's going to mean for my taxes.
Sure. Well, one basic principle here is that the vast majority of taxpayers, should get a tax break. It is unfair the way that we're doing it today. That's why people deserve a break. So, when you talk about the tax system that we have today, the very regressive system that we have today, as I say, taxes people at the bottom much higher than that taxes people at the top. So we're just trying to even that out a little more. And I think we can do it in a variety of ways, but one of them is to lower the burden on the regressive taxes, and that's property taxes, and raise the burden on those who can most afford to pay.
So you can't give us a dollar amount, like 50 to 100,000 is one thing. You can't give us a range there of what you would consider middle class.
No, but if you think about what the vast majority means, you're certainly talking about, 80, 90% of taxpayers getting a tax break. And so that to me, it's important to have that as a basic principle in going into negotiations around the rates. But Republicans and Democrats will have a lot to give input around what those rates ought to be at what levels.
Would you envision the corporate income tax increase would see an increase as well?
Oh, I think it would be related to corporate taxes as well. Just like we have today, there's a relationship between the tax rates that individuals pay and what corporations pay. We also need to look at the tax breaks that corporations are getting today, loopholes that we're offering to people, and make sure that the ones that we're offering are the kinds of incentives that we want in the state, and that there are things, no doubt, that we ought to look at and ask the question, is that really something we want to incentivize or need to incentivize?
Okay. How much money do you need to raise in order to accomplish the goals you want?
Well, I've been really clear about what my priorities are, and you can look at each of the plans around education, around healthcare, around job creation, and know that actually what I've proposed is very reasonable. Our health care coverage in the state can be expanded significantly without costing the taxpayers a dime. That's the plan that I put forward. It's called a public option, and I call it Illinois Cares. And it will allow people to buy into the state's health insurance plan at cost. And so that won't cost taxpayers anything. People will actually buy into it, but it's thousands of dollars less than a private health insurance plan would be. And so it puts thousands of dollars back on the table for middle-class families, puts thousands of dollars back on the table for working class families. It's extraordinarily important that we look at raising the standards of living of working people all across the state of Illinois. That's why that plan is important. Now, remember, I also believe that job creation comes from small businesses for the most part, big businesses too, but small businesses are very important to nurture. And many people work for small businesses, and many small businesses can't afford to offer a health insurance plan. My plan would actually give them an option to offer health insurance at a much lower rate. So we can expand health care in the state without spending taxpayer dollars. That's one thing. Second is that investing in early childhood education allows us to save money. So there's a trade-off there, but the trade-off is a good one for taxpayers. There's all kinds of research and important information for people to look at that proves the point that I'm making, the thing that I've been fighting for more than 20 years. We can implement fiscal responsibility by investing in early childhood education because it lowers the cost of K-12 education, but all the remedial programs, and very importantly, it leads to outcomes that bring more tax revenue into the state. More kids graduate from high school, more kids graduate from college, more kids, adults get jobs as a result of early childhood education investment, and many fewer end up incarcerated and in programs that the state has to pay for. So those are all, I think, very beneficial, important things for us to do. We need to go at it with some determination, and that will allow us to lower costs in state government. And then, of course, we need to increase funding across the board and provide a quality education for every child in K-12 education. There are lots of things that are missing from our K-12 education. The biggest one that I want to point out is we need to bring back vocational training and career and technical education into our high schools, because not everybody is going to choose to go to college. Not everybody does choose today to go to college. And we need to make sure that they can get the skills that they need so they can get good paying jobs without getting a 4-year degree. we also need to make sure that if you go to college, you don't get strapped with debt for the rest of your life. So those are all things that are priorities for me and won't cost the state much money, but there are trade-offs, of course. We need a balanced budget in the state. We need real economic growth in the state to bring revenue in to help us pay for the priorities that I think we all share.
A lot of those priorities you were just saying, though, those payoffs are not immediate. They're down the line. Early childhood education, for instance, those I'm familiar with those studies you cited, but those are savings 10, 15, 20 years down the line. What do you do in the interim? Because if you're going to inject more money into paying for early childhood, you don't realize those savings for a decade at least.
Well, there are two things that I'd like to address. First is that actually the savings come very soon after you invest in early childhood education. Remember, there are remedial programs even toward third grade reading scores and trying to get kids ready for those tests, for example. Lots of savings associated with that and savings associated with special education spending that the state does today. So we actually do get the benefit of it nearly immediately. I was pointing out some of the very long-term benefits, which are enormous, and we should recognize, and that's the second part of the answer that I want to give to you, which is we need to stop thinking about the next year only and start thinking about the future of the state of Illinois for the next 10 and 20 and 30 years. What kind of an economy do we want to create? What kind of an education system do we want? And we need to turn the ship of state, this aircraft carrier that is the state of Illinois, in the direction of long-term good decision-making and long-term benefit to working families across the state. And that's the basis of many of the plans that I've put forward.
Okay. My initial question to you had been about how much money needs to be raised in order to fund the various initiatives you have that you believe are needed to right the state. So you don't have an exact dollar figure for that?
Well, we've talked about some of the ways that we'll make savings in state government, and then, some of the priorities that I have for spending. But those things I think will interact in creating a balanced budget. But here's the most important thing I think for people to focus on, which is we really haven't balanced the budget of the state of Illinois for a long time. There's a requirement that it's balanced, but people don't actually balance it over the years. We have the structural deficit that exists in the state, and then we've got all the infrastructure deficit that exists and so many other ways. We need to start being real about this, and so that requires people to talk in ways that are real about solving the problems. Bruce Rauner doesn't talk in those ways. He doesn't propose things that really make that happen. He talks about a property tax freeze. That sounds great, except how are you going to pay for schools if you want to make sure you've got a quality education for every child and you put a property tax freeze in a system that is virtually, the vast majority of funding comes from local property taxes? How's that going to work? He doesn't tell you that. He says that he wants to create jobs, and the state hasn't done that. That is creating jobs and attracting business to the state of Illinois. That's how you want to grow revenues. That's the best way to do it. Give people jobs, better paying jobs, help people get a job so they can pay taxes, attract businesses to the state of Illinois, which will bring more revenue to the state. These are all things that Bruce Rauner has utterly and completely failed at. He's created fewer jobs in the last 3.5 years than Pat Quinn did in a similar time period. And he complained about the slow job growth under Pat Quinn. I've spent my life trying to help create jobs, in fact, my career anyway, helping to create jobs, and have, in fact, created thousands and thousands of jobs. I founded 1871, which is now the world's best small business incubator. It's right here in Illinois. I think that's something we can do all across the state. More than 7,000 or 8,000 jobs have been created by 1871, hundreds of companies. We need to help small businesses grow. We need an economy that's growing. These are all things that Bruce Rauner has utterly failed at.
When it comes to the graduated income tax, I think where a lot of people are struggling is they don't know the rates that you're looking for. They don't know the brackets. They don't know how much money you need to accomplish your goals. What you're basically saying is trust me. And trusting the legislature and the state has gotten us with $130 billion unfunded pension liability. As you noted, we haven't had a balanced budget, and it's debatable if we've ever had a balanced budget outside of on paper. So why should voters trust you to do right by them with this tax when you can't provide the most basic details that they would want to know about how this will affect them?
Well, I think we need to start with a basic question, which is, do we think that the tax system that's in the state of Illinois today is fair? And I think all evidence would indicate it's not. When working poor are paying a higher rate of tax than very wealthy people in the state, that doesn't seem fair to me. And the vast majority of states and the United States have recognized that fact. So let's just talk about basic fairness and ask the question, shouldn't we change the system for the better? As to how to pay for the budget that we've got and make sure that we're funding the priorities, again, that's a decision that will be made between a governor and a legislature and a governor who talks to both sides of the aisle, something that it's been too long in Illinois since it's happened. I remember the days when Republicans and Democrats talked to one another and got things done together. That hasn't happened for an awful long time, and Bruce Rauner's been the ultimate example of that terrible change. Unwilling to walk into the room to finalize and get a budget actually passed, unwilling to work with people on the other side of the aisle, attacking people across the aisle every day of his administration. He's a failure. He fails to recognize that you've got to work together to get things done. So that's why I think, we need to start talking in real ways about how to work together to solve the problems. A fair tax system is one way in which we can make the tax system and the budget of the state of Illinois work for working families.
I just think it's hard when you don't know how specifically it will affect me to trust that the Capitol will do right by you.
Well, if you think about the vast majority of people getting a tax break, it tells you a lot about at least what my priorities are in terms of who it is that we need to help in the state. Bruce Rauner hasn't proposed any of that. In fact, he talks a game about cutting the flat tax, but then spent every dime of the tax increase. He talks a good game about pensions, but hasn't really put forward any plans. In fact, the only plan that he's really put forward, the only plan that he's talked about has been where he went to leaders in Washington, D.C. and asked them to allow the state of Illinois to bankrupt the state so that he could do whatever it is that he wants to do with pensions in the state. I think you should ask him, what exactly did you mean? What exactly would that mean for people who are getting a pension or promised a pension in the state? He's been very nonspecific, and I really believe that we've got to get real about addressing these problems. And the way to get real is to make sure that you're bringing people in from both sides of the aisle to try to solve these problems.
Would all of your personal wealth, whether it's personal, business, charitable, be subject to the tax system that you're envisioning?
Yes, I mean I'm subject today to the state income tax, the flat tax that exists today. I'm subject, obviously, to those taxes and all the businesses that we do here in the state and the employees that we have here in the state of Illinois, thousands of employees. So yes, of course.
But I believe you have some of your wealth is held in, I believe there's some with an address in the Dakotas and the Bahamas. So, I mean, that money would not be subject to any a flat or a fair income tax here in the state. So how can you ask others to pay more when you have money that are intentionally shielded somewhere else?
Well, first of all, the trusts that were created generations ago offshore, I don't get any benefit from. None of that money came from me. I didn't move any money offshore. Those were created before I was born, for the most part, and I've made sure that any distribution that might come from it goes to charity. So it doesn't affect, whether the state of Illinois, would get any benefit because it all goes to charity. So, to me, the important thing is that, I've been creating jobs here in the state of Illinois, making sure that we're expanding our ability in the state to grow our economy, helping people start businesses, and, many of them have created each hundreds of jobs, and I think that's something that you want in a governor who thinks about how to expand the economy in order to bring revenue in order to create jobs for people. And that's, again, something Bruce Rauner has been an utter and complete failure at. In fact, Bruce Rauner actually created a company that helps other companies outsource jobs from the United States. That doesn't seem like something that you want from a governor.
As you've noted, it would take a constitutional amendment to get our tax structure changed. Earliest this gets in the ballot is 2020. Realistically, 2021, 2022 before this could be implemented. So what steps would you take if you were elected in order to get more tax revenue until this could be implemented?
Sure. We talked about a few of them. I'll reiterate some. I think that we ought to legalize marijuana and tax it. There are a lot of good reasons for doing that, including safety and criminal justice reform. But $1 billion of tax revenue potentially is not something to sneeze at. I believe that we need to look at sports betting as a revenue source. And then, there are areas in the sales tax system that we could look at to expand sales taxes into services. So those are three areas in which we can bring revenue into the state. Again, I want to reiterate that when we talk about how to enhance revenue in the state, the best way to do that is to draw businesses to the state. And one of the things that Bruce Rauner has utterly failed at is attracting businesses and telling people what's great about the state of Illinois. He badmouths the state everywhere he goes. When he's in state, he does it. He invites governors from surrounding states to go on TV doing it. He goes abroad and can't help himself in bad-mouthing the state. That's when you're supposed to be attracting foreign companies to the state of Illinois, and that's hard to do when the leader of the state is talking badly about the state. One thing I know about our state is we've got a lot of very attractive features for people who want to grow jobs or move their companies to the state. And that is that we've got some of the most educated and dedicated workers in the entire nation, in fact, in the entire world. And they're that way because we've had a good education system, higher education system. Bruce Rauner's proposed cutting that higher education budget by 30%. I really believe that if you want to grow the economy of a state, investing in higher education is an enormously important component, making sure that people in high school get the skills that they need if they choose not to go to college. Those are things that are critically important for economic growth, and that's the best way to bring revenue into the state.
Okay. Right now, Bruce Rauner is running an ad saying you support a mileage tax. Your campaign has said that's not true. You have, though, spoken about a VMT, vehicle mileage traveled, and about how it's an idea that the state should explore. So I guess what are you thinking here about a VMT?
Well, I've not proposed a VMT.
You said you were open to it, though, when you were the Daily Herald editorial board earlier this year. Yeah, there are a couple things I want to say. One is we got a lot of differences, Bruce Rauner and me, about how it is that we ought to operate the tax system of the state of Illinois. Certainly one big one that you've seen him talk about and me talk about is the fair tax system. I think that that's the principal difference between us. I believe that that it's important to recognize that when we had the conversation at the Daily Herald, it was about infrastructure. That's something Bruce Rauner promised to do, to get a capital bill, an infrastructure bill, when he was running for public office. He hasn't put one forward. It's been now 3.5 out of his 4 years, and he hasn't put one forward. I think it's critical for the state. It's been almost 10 years since we had a capital bill now. We shouldn't be doing it that way, once every 10 years. We ought to be investing in infrastructure more frequently than that. But we do need to invest in infrastructure. So I think that Senator Bill Brady, the Republican leader in the state Senate, had one good idea for paying for infrastructure, and that's that we ought to look at perhaps expanding gaming in the state as a source for revenue for an infrastructure bill. But what's critically important to remember is that our infrastructure is really the lifeblood of our economy in many ways. Agriculture, being a very important part of our economy, depends upon that infrastructure. We're the supply chain hub
of the nation, and we need to make sure that the warehouses and distribution centers and the companies, manufacturers that are here in the state are able to get their goods to market just like our farmers should be able to. And that means investing in roads and bridges and waterways. So it's all really in the context of infrastructure and making sure that we have sources of revenue for infrastructure.
So you're not in favor of a VMT?
I've not proposed a VMT for the state, no.
But it's an idea you think that should be explored?
Look, I think that it's important also to look at all the sources of revenue that we could potentially consider. I've really tried to focus more on the fair tax system, as when we talk about taxes in the state, or on sources like legalizing marijuana or sports betting, or expanding the sales tax coverage to services. Those I think are reasonable ideas for us to be considering as ways to fund infrastructure.
Okay, but this is not one of them then? Or it is?
It's a test in another state. I mean, it's just something that's being tested somewhere else.
Yeah, there are a lot of detailed kind of things, and I like to step back and understand. So how'd you become a Democrat?
Good question.
And then what are a couple of principles that you believe Democrats kind of universally hold?
Yeah.
And how would those be reflected in the state capitol?
Well, I think all of us would give some credit to our parents for, our belief systems.
Well, my children have turned out to be another party.
I really think, my mother is somebody that I look at who really set us, my brother and sister and I, on a path around a set of values that we believe in. And my values are reflected more by the Democratic Party than they are by the Republican Party. And those values are about social and economic justice, about equality and inclusion. My mother was, marching for the ERA and for women's reproductive rights when I was a kid, and she was taking me with her to knock on doors for progressive Democratic candidates. And and I'm proud to have grown up as a Democrat. My father was very involved in the Democratic Party. My mother was actually an elected party official at one point when I was young. So I started out in a home where my parents were Democrats. But it's those basic values, that I'm constantly monitoring, candidates and party for, are those reflective of what I believe? So, I'm a Democrat because of the basic things that I think made most people Democrats, and that is that there are some real kitchen table issues that matter to working families across Illinois and across the nation. Health care is a right. It's something that for 70 years the Democratic Party has really been the stalwart supporter of, expanding health care coverage, making sure that people have the ability to get covered. Everybody should have a doctor. That's one very important principle for me, and something that I will carry out as governor as soon as possible, getting past a public option for the state. Education, making sure that every child, and I really mean, let's start with the most at-risk kids, and that's where I've spent much of my time in early childhood, focusing on those most at-risk kids. Remember, 25% of kids nationally show up at kindergarten not ready to learn. There was actually a survey recently in Illinois that showed many more than that in Illinois show up at kindergarten not ready to learn. We've got to make sure that all those kids, as many as possible, are ready for kindergarten. Now, that may seem like, well, gee, that's just kindergarten. But guess what? When they're ready for kindergarten, when they've gotten early childhood education, many of those outcomes that I was talking about earlier have been proven to happen. They graduate from high school. They graduate from college. They get a job. Much more likely, and much less likely to have bad outcomes like being incarcerated. So those things, focusing on education, investing in education, that's what's made me a Democrat. And then, look, helping people create jobs, raise their standard of living, helping people get a better wage. We've had basically stagnant wages across Illinois for way too long. And the best way to raise wages is to have competition for labor. That's the best way. Yes, we need to raise the minimum wage, but we also need competition for labor. The more businesses want someone to choose to work for them versus another option a worker might have, the more they're willing to pay. That, I think, is very important. And then we've got to stand up for our labor unions and their collective bargaining rights, making sure that they have the ability to sit at the bargaining table with some equal power with a company. Those are all things that made me a Democrat, and the basic civil rights. Why would I choose to run the Human Rights Commission in the state if I had an opportunity to do something, versus anything else I could choose? Because standing up for civil rights and equal rights for people, that's something that's fundamental to my personal values, my family's values, the values of my faith, and I believe fundamental to what it is to be a Democrat.
You mentioned unions just now. Rauner just released a video that claims union workers striking at your family's business during the summer months had heat lamps turned on them in an effort to squash that. Do you have a response?
Well, I haven't been involved ever in the management of the hotel business that my father founded. My father passed away, 1972, and so I had nothing to do with those things. I believe in the right of workers to collectively bargain, to strike if they believe they're not being treated fairly. But most importantly, I think that respecting workers, and while my father was alive, and I watched some of that as a very young child, the respect that people should have for workers at all levels, whether they're a housekeeper or a front desk clerk or working in a restaurant or whatever it is. And so I think that's, that again, fundamental to my belief system is that workers should have that collective bargaining right.
You said you're a Democrat here in Illinois. The party is run by Michael Madigan, the House Speaker here. Your opponent has painted you as Mike Madigan's candidate with an allegation that you would not operate independently from him. And that is a concern many residents would share in this state. He's not exactly a popular politician. Define for us what your relationship with Mike Madigan is like.
Well, remember that Bruce Rauner has virtually connected everybody that he is opposed to with Mike Madigan. He even said that Jeannie Ives was a stooge or working for Mike Madigan. I think that's just silly. And I've been an independent leader my whole life. The things that I've accomplished that I talked to you about are things that I worked with people of all political stripes on, and nowhere near them had been Speaker Mike Madigan. Look, I think that you want a governor who's independent, who's going to go fight for working families, but who's going to oppose bad ideas, but who's going to work with the leaders in Springfield, Democrats and Republicans, to get something done. And that means making sure that we pass a budget. And that sounds so basic, but Bruce Rauner was unable to do it. And look, whether you like the person on the other side of the table in the bargaining or you don't, the fact is that your job is to work for the families, the people of the state of Illinois to get the job done. And job one for a governor is getting a budget passed.
I mean, how would you, what adjectives would you use to describe your relationship with Mike Madigan?
Only that he's the chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois and the Speaker of the House, and that whoever the governor is needs to work with the Speaker of the House to make sure that we actually get some priorities passed and solve some of the big problems facing the state.
Let's go into the budget there. You said the governor hasn't introduced a balanced budget or passed one. Well, the legislature hasn't either. Our latest budget is at least $1 billion out of whack. That was passed by Democrats. Are you committed to only introducing balanced budgets and only signing into law budgets that the General Assembly sends you that are balanced?
Of course. I think it's critically important for the state that we have a balanced budget. And it means that we've got to look at every aspect of the budget and ask, is this real? Is this, are we actually paying for the priorities that we need to pay for? And, what efficiencies can we bring to state government in order to make sure that we're balancing the budget? I don't think that, selling the Thompson Center twice in 2 budgets in a row is a good way to balance the budget.
So if that budget had been sent to you, would you have vetoed it?
I think, again, when you're sitting down and negotiating the budget and actually getting the job done, which, remember, Bruce Rauner got, he put forward such a bad idea for a budget that he actually got pushed aside. It was Republicans and Democrats in the legislature who ultimately got this latest budget passed. One of the ideas that Bruce Rauner put forward, you may know, is pushing down $1 billion of state expenditures to local governments. And you know what that would mean. That would mean lower. That would mean his idea for freezing local property taxes would be impossible, as I think it is even today, because he's not put forward a real plan for that. What would it mean? Raising property taxes by $1 billion. That's what Bruce Rauner proposed. Such a bad idea that Republicans and Democrats rejected it. We need to actually balance the budget. You need to actually sit in the room ahead of time and negotiate a budget to make sure that we've got an actually balanced budget for and I intend to do that for all 4 years of my term.
Okay. Another issue, and we'd argue as an edit board that it would be the most pressing issue facing the state, is the unfunded pension liability. How would you address the unfunded liability?
Well, I wouldn't do what Bruce Rauner suggested, which was to bankrupt the state. I think that the Supreme Court has ruled on this. So people should stop talking about, how do we take people's pensions away, and instead talk about how do we pay for the pensions that were promised. You can have a debate all day long about whether you think the benefits that were offered to people were right at the time they were offered, but it doesn't matter at this point. The real question is, what are you going to do to pay for the unfunded portion of the liability? There are some good ideas out there that we should consider. One that I have pointed to is that, as you know, the pension ramp that was put in place in 1995 was exacerbated. The problem with it was exacerbated by the failure of, I think, 2 different governors to pay for pensions. They offered themselves pension holidays, and that made the problem much worse. But the pension ramp that was put in place, which I'll just with my hands describe as this, which is now made worse by the failure to pay pensions, means that for us to have a budget, to manage a budget going forward in the state, you somehow have to level out the amount that's being paid in to the pensions. And the best way to do that, and sort of cap it in a way, and the best way to do that is to pay, just as you would on your own home if you'd agreed to this amortization schedule on your own home, you'd have to pay principal payments a little bit earlier so that you could level out the payments going forward just to manage your own home budget. That's how we need to do it in the state. We need to make sure that we're putting a little more in earlier, leveling it out, going forward, so that in a budget the size of this state, that it doesn't get overwhelmed by what is a pension required payment. I believe that it's important to make the pledge, and I would make this pledge here, that I'm going to make sure we pay the pensions that are owed every single year of my term in office. That's something that other governors didn't want to live up to, and thought they could balance the budget by avoiding, and that's not something we can do going forward. All of the effort made in the past to deal with pensions has been, I think, failed in most ways that we could identify, and that you need somebody who's actually going to put shoulder to the wheel, bring the parties to the table to make sure that we're paying the pensions that are owed, and that we're also doing it in a way that doesn't overwhelm the budget.
What about going forward? Do you think what level of benefits should the state provide to state employees who are new, who are just coming into the system?
Well, there's a Tier 2 system, as you know, that was put in place that bends that cost curve, lowers the amount. Many of the things that were done in the past we need to make sure we avoid. I mentioned one, which is avoiding pension payments. Another that needs to be avoided is, massive early retirement programs, which will put additional burden on the pension plan for the state. So those are things that we should look at. But here's a basic principle we ought to live by, which is people who got promised a pension and who've relied on that pension as they've been working for these many years should get paid the pension that they were promised. Bruce Rauner's suggestion that we should bankrupt the state in order to get rid of that pension liability is a suggestion to take away people's pensions. I don't think that's right. I will fight tooth and nail against that.
Will you also, though, make sure that whatever is promised is for the taxpayers? Because at the end of the day, the taxpayers are the ones who will be paying these pensions. And you said perhaps we shouldn't go back and say it wasn't fair, or we shouldn't have done that in the past, made these promises. But the fact is, they made these promises, and they're not paying the repercussions of the taxpayers are. So,
right.
I mean, how important is it to you to get the taxpayers a fair deal as well?
Yep, there's been irresponsible leadership. There's no doubt about it. And again, Bruce Rauner's done nearly nothing about this during his term in office. He talks about it, but then doesn't do anything about it. And there have been irresponsible leaders in the past. And we can go all the way. Remember, there have been more years of Republican governors than Democratic governors over the last 40 years. And so it's not isolated to one party or another. I think the state has failed to make sure that we could pay the pension, that we've got the liability under control, and that we're putting enough into our pension system. That 95 pension ramp was designed to try to deal with it, but then nobody lived by the rules of it, and here we are living with a pension ramp that's much too high, and unexpectedly so because of irresponsibility by Republicans and Democrats. So I absolutely believe we need to be fair to our taxpayers in the state, and it's important that that a fair tax system be put in place in order to make sure that whatever needs to be paid for in the state, that burden doesn't fall disproportionately on the middle class and on people striving to get to the middle class, and instead on people who can most afford to pay.
Related to pensions, there is an idea floating around out there to move teacher pensions from the state to the local district. Would you be in favor of that?
No. I think that this is part of an effort by Bruce Rauner to try to balance the budget by pushing something away from the state budget that belongs at the state level historically and currently.
I guess why would you argue that? I mean, teachers are local employees. They're not state employees.
Yeah, but remember what he was proposing was his effort to balance the budget was to take $1 billion off of the state and push it down literally to local governments raising local property taxes. That doesn't seem like a good solution to the pension problem to me.
But I mean, is it fair that a downstate place or school district where their teachers are paid much less than a suburban Chicago district, they're essentially paying for the pensions of teachers that were promised much higher salaries than their teachers were paid? Why should they be paying for pensions for where they saw no benefit from those employees?
Well, but that the pensions, that are being paid, Bruce Rauner wants to make it seem like that somehow disproportionately Chicago is benefiting and downstate is not. He's tried to pit downstate against Chicago and Chicago against downstate for his entire term. I think that's, completely ridiculous. There is, as you know, the way that the payments have been made at the state government level is trying to balance the interests so that all teachers benefit in a somewhat equalized way. And Bruce Rauner just ignores that and tries to make it seem like it's very unfair. I think the most important thing that the principle here is let's make sure the teachers get the pensions that they were promised. Because, teachers are not getting overpaid in the state of Illinois. They're not. And teachers were promised a salary when they took a job, and they were promised benefits. And it seems like that's the state shaking hands with a worker and saying, this is what you're due. And so to try to take that away or to change the way we provide those benefits, that it doesn't seem appropriate to me.
You've mentioned early childhood education multiple times here. It's something you've championed for years. What remains to be done in that area that you would implement if you were governor?
We need to move toward universal preschool. I think that there should be no child in the state, and I mean particularly focused now on the at-risk kids who live across the state, the forgotten communities. No child should be left out of preschool. I think we all recognize the science that tells us that kids aren't starting to learn at 5 or 6 years old. They're starting to learn much earlier than that, in fact, at birth. And that's why quality preschool and quality childcare are enormously important to provide. And that means in every community and every family in the state. Like I said, we're costing ourselves more than we should when we don't provide that quality preschool and childcare for kids. They end up behind when they show up at K-12 education, and sometimes are never able to catch up, and that costs the taxpayers much more than if we just provided them with the proper education at those earlier ages.
Just while we're on the topic of kids, the Department of Children and Family Services has had some pretty high-profile cases in the last year. In Joliet, there was the death of a young girl. Recently, there was that fire, killed 10 children in Chicago. I think it's pretty evident that there's either not enough workers to handle the caseload or that they're not doing an adequate job at following up on some of their cases. What types of reforms would you institute in DCFS in order to get the state's most vulnerable children the care and support they need?
Well, this is an area that I care deeply about. Again, much of the work that I've done has been for the most at-risk kids in our state, and DCFS has under its care many of those at-risk kids. Let's start with, it takes leadership from the top. And that means stability in leadership at the DCFS where, we've had, I think, I'm not sure the number, I think it's 8 leaders over 9 years, some number like that. It's, the turnover is enormous in leadership there. There's some good people who work at DCFS, very good people, and we need to enhance and strengthen their ability to do their job by making sure we actually fill the job openings that have come up. We need to pay people adequately for the job that they do. Our foster children in the state sometimes get terribly neglected. Foster kids get dropped off of the system way too early. You don't just sort of, hit an age and all of a sudden, you don't need anything else. And so we've got to make sure that we're providing at those later years some better services, and DCFS could be the provider of those, and we need to make sure that we're funding them properly, of course, too. But the terrible tragedies that have occurred at DCFS that were preventable, I think by better leadership, better management in state government are, the responsibility of the leadership of the state. And, when those things occur, you would hope you'd hear more from the governor about what he's going to do to address it. You really hear almost nothing from this governor. What is he going to do to protect our most at-risk kids and do a better job at DCFS? And we've heard almost nothing.
Another area you expressed interest in improving upon, you've got a commercial out about this, is mental health. What services do you want, what do you want to see change on how the state handles mental health issues?
Mental health is health, and we don't treat it that way across the state. In fact, we've separated it out like it's some other subject matter. Healthcare is healthcare, and that includes mental health and the rest of your body's physical health. So we've got to first raise up the subject of mental health, make sure that it's incorporated into the way we treat physical health, and then have a leader who talks about mental health and makes it apparent to everybody that this is not something that belongs any longer in the shadows. It should no longer be a stigma that people carry because they've got a mental health challenge. And then we've got to recognize about mental health the relationship between it and the problem of addiction that we've got across the state of Illinois. In treating many people with opioid addiction, for example, what we find is many of them have a comorbidity with mental health. And some of them were actually self-medicating when they decided that they, were going to try some kind of opioid or, any addictive substance that they may have tried, that they're self-medicating, they're not getting the mental health care that they need, and so they're trying something else, and that leads to yet more state expenditure too. So not only an enormous problem for that person who just needed mental health care, but now it gets burdened upon the taxpayers of the state when someone is on Medicaid, for example, ends up with both the comorbidities. Remember, treating mental health also means that we can lower the cost of our criminal justice system. There's less incarceration. I've talked to police officers in Rockford, for example, where because of the failure of our mental health system, because Bruce Rauner failed to get a budget passed for a couple of years, and so many fewer people working in mental health, so many fewer patients able to get services. The police departments across the state have had to become the mental health service providers by incarcerating people, literally putting them in jail because they might be a challenge to have, living where they're living or on the street because they've demonstrated that they need help and then they might be a danger to others. We need to treat these folks, make sure that mental health is out in the open, people understand it, and that we've got the available services for them. It'll lower the cost to taxpayers if we do it. And that's something important to recognize. Bruce Rauner talks about balancing the budget by making cuts across the board. He's made massive cuts as a result of his failures and his proposals. But many of the things that state government provides are actually saving money in the long run. Again, when you cut HIV testing, then you end up finding out someone's got HIV or full-blown AIDS at a much later point. That costs everybody much more money than treating it much earlier. Same with diabetes prevention and diabetes treatment. Those are massive costs to the state that Bruce Rauner caused as a result of his cuts or failures with the state budget. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. But I'm back to the point you're asking about mental health. Let's bring it out of the shadows.
Okay. You've laid out, I feel you're very progressive agenda, what you're looking for, that you're a progressive personally. Are you too progressive for parts of the state that are more conservative, like those around here who voted for Donald Trump for president?
Well, I don't know whether it's progressive to say that everybody deserves to have health care. I think that's just something that's a reality. People should have a doctor. I don't think it's necessarily considered too progressive to be for early childhood education when we know the science points us to saving money in state government. I'm a guy who's created a lot of jobs and believes that job creation is the best way for us to grow our economy and to get us out of the fiscal challenges that we've got in our state. I don't know if that's too progressive, but those are things that I stand for, those basic kitchen table issues. I think that's why I have connected well with people in central and southern Illinois, because I think people are hurting all across the state as a result of Bruce Rauner's failures. We've got to start addressing the real challenge for people of their incomes are stagnant, they're not able to access health care, and their kids are not getting the quality education that they deserve.
Okay. Civility in politics is something that's been a topic of late, something I know we'd like to see more of. So we ask you, what has Bruce Rauner done well during his term as governor?
First thing I would say is that Bruce Rauner came into office, making a lot of promises about making changes in state government. And I know he stood up for his principles. and I've been critical of his unwillingness to compromise. But I guess if there's a compliment to be had in there, it would be, that he came in with a set of ideological principles, and I guess he's been sticking to those for the entire term. I don't think that's a good way for a governor to operate, but because I think in the end, you've got to have principles and you've got to get things done. But I do think that having a set of principles is important when you're going to take public office. And, I have a very strong set of principles about what I believe. I've shared some of those with you today, but it's really centered around lifting up working families in the state.
Okay. Would you live in the governor's mansion if you're elected?
I will.
Okay. Any other questions, John? Anything? All right. Well, we're at the end of our time, so we thank you for meeting with us today, and we invite you to give a brief closing statement as to why you think voters should make you the next governor of Illinois.
Thank you. And again, thanks for the opportunity to chat with you about all of these issues. I think it's time to put Springfield back on the side of working families, to stand up for the basic principles that have been so important in our state for so long. I think you want a governor who's going to stand up for those principles even when someone of their own party is challenging them. Bruce Rauner was unwilling to stand up to his own president, Donald Trump, when Donald Trump was trying to take away 1 million people's health care in the state. He said nothing about that. He was unwilling to stand up for, I think, 6 days after the president said there were very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville. It took him 6 days to really come out with a strong statement standing up against the president of the United States. I think you want a governor whose principles, whose values are reflective of the history of the state of Illinois and the people of the state of Illinois today. Someone who has been a fighter for civil rights, someone who believes in expanding people's ability to get a better wage and health care in our state. And those are things that I've worked on for many years and intend to be a leader on as governor of the state. So I think all across the state, central Illinois, southern Illinois, Cook County, the collar counties, I think people share the same set of values around those kitchen table issues and about what they believe is important, and I'm going to fight hard for them all across the state.